Thank you very much, Bishop Pat, and thank you everybody who's come along to hear all of us speaking to you tonight. Does that sound okay? Am I not too close to the mics? So talking about success, leadership and the impact of Christian values on my career, on all of our careers, I think to begin with it's a little bit hard for me to say that the job of a PR person is actually really a leadership role, because when you're communicating, you're really the messenger, you're not the message. You're the messenger, you're the conduit through which that information flows through to people. And I guess that success is measured by whether we've been effective in getting one's message across to the public, and whether we have in some ways raised the profile of the church here in our community. And I think maybe, after what Bishop Pat just said, I think maybe it's fair to say that we have, to a very large extent. Now, I've been told, I'm keeping an eye on the time too, because it's very hard to let it all run away with you. I've been asked if I would just say something about my background, because when I'm talking in public, it's normally about the church, it's about some issue, some matter of concern at the present time. So just to say something about who I am, and I'll try to make it quite brief. I came into church communications in 1985, so that's, I think, 27 years ago. And after a number of years as a journalist and a columnist and I had a kind of secondary career going on, still sort of do as a part-time professional, semi-professional singer. I worked for years for INL, the newspaper group which then became Fairfax. Many of you will know about Fairfax, and they're certainly having their troubles at the moment, that's for sure. I worked in the Auckland office of the Waikato Times. I was actually its manager. And then I was transferred to the Sunday News, of all papers, and I was asked if I would do a weekly column, a full page, and I did it every week for several years. And do you know what I was? I was the agony aunt. And I had to choose a pseudonym. I couldn't use my own name, but they don't let you generally use your own name because, or they didn't back then, because you're a target for all sorts of unusual people. So, and then a photograph, I wasn't allowed to use my own photograph, so they gave me a whole sheaf of syndicated photographs of beautiful models, and I chose the one with lovely long blonde hair who looked really, really nice, and I had to choose a name, and so I chose the name Gabby Fulton. Is there anybody here who would read the Sunday, who would admit to reading the Sunday News? And who would have ever heard of Gabby Fulton? For years and years I did that column, and even when I was in the hospital in Martyr Maternity having our son, I still had the letters being brought to me, and I had to give the replies through a dictaphone. So that was, and actually when I started working for the church, the Metro magazine, many of you will be familiar with Metro, and back then, and I don't know whether they still do, there was a gossip column called Felicity Ferret. Felicity Ferret. And one day after it was announced all over the place that I was now the communications person for the Auckland Diocese, there was a piece in Felicity Ferret's column, and it said, "Sprung. Gabby Fulton is no other than God's little messenger, Lyndsay Freer." So I was back then working for several years in mainstream media, and I was very much part of that scene. I was, as it were, on the other side of the divide from where I am now. And one of the things that I really felt when I came into my job working in communications for the church was how we all were perceived as being very countercultural by the media. I had had no experience of that. And so that was something that was really quite difficult to come to terms with, because not only being perceived as countercultural, but also being on the receiving end of quite a lot of hostility and criticism at times from within the church community too, I must say, because the mainstream message that we try to give out doesn't always sit comfortably with everybody in the church, so it's always sort of a case of you win one, you lose one, I think. So then that was all right, and then in 1985 I was appointed to be the communications person for the Auckland Diocese, and I worked in that by Bishop Dennis Brown, and I worked in that role for 10 years, and the following year, 86, I cut my teeth on the visit of Pope John Paul when he came here to Auckland, and that was the highlight really of those 10 years. It was a wonderful experience because we had media here from all over New Zealand, but from all around the world. And we had to, one of my jobs was finding the right people to be the voiceover for radio and television broadcasts of the masses and the events and so on. It was checking media accreditation, it was giving out media kits. It was just wonderful. But above all, it was the, excuse me, the great privilege of meeting the Pope. And the reason that came about was, excuse me, one of my friends in the media was Merv Smith. You remember Merv Smith? Of the breakfast program on News Talk ZB some years ago. He was a big personality in the media. And he said to me one day, it would be really great if we could do something to encourage young people to meet the Pope. Is there something we could do? And we talked about it and came up with the idea that we would put out a competition for young people, Catholics and non-Catholic children under the age of 11 or something, I think it was 11 or 12. And they had to write what would they say to the Pope if they met him. And so we got thousands of, and the prize was meeting him, of course, thousands of entries, and we spent hours reading through them all. And the winner was a little girl, perhaps 9 or 10, from one of our primary schools, our Catholic primary schools here in Auckland. And it was lovely that I was able to take her up the steps in the domain up to that area that was the sort of altar and then the stage. And she met him, and she gave him some flowers, and he was just so lovely. He put his arms around her, and he chatted away to both of us. It was really quite lovely. So that was that, and that went on for 10 years. And then I was invited to apply for the job of National Communications Director for the Bishops' Conference. And I got that job and did that for 10 years. We set up an office in Auckland, a staff here in Auckland at Pompeii Centre. And that was a really wonderful experience for those 10 years before the office was disestablished. And the highlight for me at that time was being in Rome in April in 2005, 7 years ago, when Pope John Paul died. I was actually there in Rome in St. Peter's Square with the thousands of people looking up at his window with the light, knowing that his death was very imminent. And then when it was announced that he died, it was an amazing experience. My cell phone ringing, and it was TVNZ who had a crew down at the back of the square near the press office wanting an interview. And then going back to Rome 2 weeks later for the conclave, and being there right underneath the balcony when the white smoke came up and the announcement was made and the bells rang and the cell phone rang, and it was Paul Holmes back here in New Zealand for the breakfast program on News Talk ZB again, wanting to know all about it. And so that was again a wonderful experience. Bishop Pat said about being the face or voice of the church, which is actually unfortunate in some ways, because although that was written into my contract, the idea was to get as many other people, and particularly as many bishops as possible, to speak to the media. But I found that Bishop Pat was always readily available, but so many bishops were busy, were not available, didn't want to, said you do it, find somebody else. Some because they didn't like the media, some because they didn't feel they had the confidence. And one of our tasks was to actually arrange media training for the bishops. Most of them availed of that, some didn't, unfortunately. And I can understand how they felt suspicious about the media, because over the years we have had some unfair comment, and I think they didn't really want to be on a public screen, going out live or on radio, having all sorts of questions coming at them from left field. Now, since 2008, when that office of ours in the national office was closed down, Bishop Pat then invited me to come back and be the media person for the Auckland Diocese, and I do that on a part-time basis, and I also work for 2 hours a week for the Society of Mary, the Marist Fathers. So measuring success. I've written down a few things here. It's a bit hard to measure success when you're a PR person. I think the measure probably is the fact that when the media come, one is prepared and ready, one is proactive and anticipates issues and events that are going to be aired in the media and being ready for it. So if that's success, I suppose to a good degree we have been successful. We have actually helped the public to become a lot more aware of the church. And for leadership, well, I think that's another thing. I think the measure of success, I've written it down here, is that in recent years, the media often comes to us, the Catholic Church, the Catholic media people, as the first port of call to make some comment on any issue that any moral or ethical issue that, or justice issue that they're talking about. So I think the fact that we are, it seems, the first port of call, we can say that we have actually taken a very good leadership role with the media. And I have to say, of course, that like every other PR person who works for any organisation, one is only as successful as one's bosses. And I've had two very good bosses in Bishop Pat and Bishop Dennis. There have been some very difficult times. One of them was, do you remember the Te Papa exhibition, The Virgin in a Condom? And I was asked with very little notice to go on a TV debate live with Bill Ralston, who was the host, and three other people, all of whom, apart from Bill, were approving of that Virgin in a Condom exhibition, and I was the lone voice. And that really was quite a difficult time. I think that I was lucky that having that experience all the years before that as a singer, I had to get up on stage, I had to memorize music and words and moves and all of those things, and have to, no matter how apprehensive or nervous I was feeling, I had to smile and look absolutely calm and relaxed. And I think some of the very hairy media interviews I've done, I think that sort of background has stood me in good stead, because when it comes to talking about some of those issues, you know, one sort of goes and talks to the media with fear and trepidation, but it probably helped to just keep smiling and keep one's head down, as it were. I think the media now is different from what it was when I first began. There's been a loss of deference in the media. Back years ago, there were conventions that the media didn't write or broadcast the private life, perhaps the sordid details of the private lives of people in authority, particularly people like the royal family and so on. But now, anything goes. Now, you can't keep the lid on anything. I mean, we've seen just lately all the Vati leaks coming from Rome, which is actually a very, very serious problem. And you see, the media really isn't bound by many conventions. They're bound by the law. They're bound by the guidelines of the various bodies like the Broadcasting Standards Authority and the Newspaper Proprietors Association and so on. But apart from that, it's a free-for-all. And because we in the Church try to tell people how they might best live according to the gospel and so on, the media doesn't like that, because in this free society with basic human rights and individual freedoms, you don't tell people how they should live their lives. And so, therefore, I think the media at large have found the Church very difficult to deal with, because they see us as being authoritarian. And in this consumer culture that we have, we challenge it in the Church, the media tends to legitimize it. So, in many ways, as I say, we are very countercultural. But on the other hand, I firmly believe that the media has done us a great service. And I'm coming in a moment to the Christian values on my work, because that's the most important part of all. And particularly was it important for me when I had to deal with I suppose one would almost have to say the tsunami of sexual abuse that began in the late 1980s. And I think that the media, because I used to work in the media, they are generally reasonable people doing their job, trying to find the truth about a story. And I think that through their investigation and so on, they've actually done us in the Church a very good service. They've actually, as I say, lifted the lid on abuse and on areas of corruption that, because we're all human, do happen in the Church from time to time. So I think, I'm in many ways on the side of the media. And I think it's very important that we realise that they do a very good job in many ways. And without them, without a free media, where would we all be? I think we know the answer to that one. Now, the sexual abuse crisis, it was a terrible time for all of us. It was, we all had a great sense of betrayal because the people whom we trusted and whose integrity we totally believed in were really doing enormous harm to young people. And so apart from the sense of betrayal and disbelief and all of the rest of it, I was at the time, when it all happened, the mother of a young boy. And so you can imagine that I felt great anger when I heard about the abuse issues. And in the church, we're perceived as taking the high ground when it comes to moral issues, and particularly with sexual morality. And so that when one of our people falls from grace, it's the media targets us, and I think probably fairly too. So it was, as I say, it was a very, very difficult time, but we did believe that we had to be as open and transparent as we possibly could. We did a lot of work on it in the church, on our media relations in those years. We still do. There were times when we couldn't really comment, and as a PR person, I firmly believe that you never ever say no comment. That shouldn't be in anyone's vocabulary, because there's always something you can say. You can always say, look, I can't say anything about that at the moment because an investigation is taking place, or it's before the courts or something, but when it is possible for us to speak, well, we certainly will, and we did. And but there were many times in those years where people who had been abused and who had suffered terribly at the hands of people in the church would, when an issue was resolved, ask if it could be kept very confidential. We used to always say to people, we encourage you to go to the police, because the police have far greater powers of investigation than we have. But there were some people who didn't want to go down that path. They wanted to keep it, as it were, in-house. They wanted it dealt with in the church. They wanted an apology. They wanted some kind of compensation, hopefully in the right sense of that word. And they just wanted to know that something was being done about it. And so we always readily agreed to that kind of confidentiality. And then we might find, as time went on, that perhaps one of those people would have some counselling, and the counsellors would say, I think we need to talk to the media about this. We're not happy with the outcomes. And of course, the fact is, you can never be happy with the outcomes. There is no good outcome from any kind of abuse. We can just do what we can, but we can't, only God can heal the terrible hurt that's been done to people. But then, so they would break that confidentiality and go to the media and say all kinds of terrible things about the church, some of which were absolutely untrue and unfair. But I couldn't stand before the media and say, well, look, that's an outright lie. I just had to say, well, we can't speak about it because we agreed to the confidentiality clause. It's over to them if they want it, but we really can't say anything. And times I must say I was very, very angry about that. Now look, I'll try and wind up, because I think, excuse me, I'm coming fairly close to the end of it. I think back to my faith, and I think when you're a person who is conveying publicly the message of the church, you have to absolutely believe in it. You actually have to have that fire in your belly that you believe what you're talking about, otherwise you can't possibly be sincere. And, you know, when I saw the tragic consequences of those who'd been abused, and when I saw the brokenness of the perpetrators, the abusers, you know, it was only really that I believed in the compassion and the forgiveness of God, and in rehabilitation and in redemption, that I could possibly keep doing the job I did. The very first time I met a priest who had been convicted of abuse, I never knowingly ever met a child abuser. I didn't think I had. And when this priest came into my office to do an interview on the Home Show, he agreed to do it, and so we did it in my office so that I could hop in and step in, and it was pre-recorded if they excuse me, asked questions that were not appropriate. And this little man, this little priest from the South Island, came in and was absolutely shattered and broken. He'd been convicted and sentenced to community service. And I have to say, my heart really went out to him, because I could see what his actions had actually done to his life. And I know that wasn't a popular message to give to people, because naturally our sympathies were with the abuser. But when you saw the brokenness of people who had actually been themselves abusers, and many of them themselves abused as young people, you couldn't help but feel for them and know that, that God would also died for them and would also look after them and redeem them. And so that really is what has sort of guided me in the work that I've been doing. You have to, I think, when you're working with the media, have a good sense of humour. You have to get on side with them. They have to learn to respect you. You mustn't use spin. We all know what spin is. And do you know it got its name from, the term comes from the spin that's put on a ball when you want the ball to go in a certain direction. And so that's what media spin is, manipulating your message so that people hear only what you want them to hear, even if it's not the truth. I do want to actually beg your indulgence to read to you a piece that is, to me, the classic example of spin. It's absolutely true. It's not telling any lies, but it is just so clever because it doesn't give anything like the real facts of the matter. Now, I don't know whether it's true. I'm told that maybe it's not, but it's certainly a very, very good piece, and the people who were named in it, I actually think, agreed that it was also quite lovely. And it goes like this. It's about the former Prime Minister of Australia, Mr. Rudd. What was his name? Kevin Rudd. So a young woman was an amateur genealogist, and she was a researcher doing work on her family tree, and she discovered that the former Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd's great-great-uncle, called Remus Rudd, was hanged for horse stealing and train robbery in Melbourne in 1889. Have you heard of this? Some of you may have heard this one. It's a real classic. Anyway, horse stealing and train robbery. The only known photograph of him is standing on the gallows at the Melbourne jail. And on the back of the picture, during her research, this girl found the inscription, Remus Rudd, horse thief, sent to Melbourne jail 1885, escaped 1887, robbed the Melbourne-Geelong train 6 times, caught by Victoria Police, convicted and hanged in 1889. So this woman emailed Prime Minister Rudd for information about their great-great-uncle Remus. And believe it or not, his staff sent back the following biographical sketch for her research. And it went like this. Remus Rudd was famous in Victoria during the mid to late 1880s. His business empire grew to include acquisition of valuable equestrian assets and intimate dealings with the Melbourne-Geelong Railroad. Beginning in 1883, he devoted several years of his life to government service, finally taking his leave to resume his dealings with the railroad. In 1887, he was a key player in a vital investigation run by the Victoria Police Force. In 1889, Remus passed away during an important civic function held in his honour when the platform upon which he was standing collapsed. So that's spin. Now I can tell you that we don't do that in the church, but something that really heartened me 2 days ago. I was reading my daily bulletin of news that comes in from the Vatican, and we all know about the Vati leaks, all of this documentation that's being leaked by various sources in the Vatican. The butler did it and all that sort of thing. Many of you would have read that. The Vatican, at long last, thank God, has appointed a top-shot PR journalist to really run its public relations. His name is Greg Burke. He's an American who's lived in Rome for about 20 years. He's actually been the Rome correspondent for Fox News, for goodness sake. But anyway, he's been employed to do this job, and it looks from the way the Vatican puts it all out, they use a fair bit of sort of double speak sometimes, but it appears reading between the lines that they want this man to actually completely oversee the communications that come from all the Vatican departments, including the Secretariat of State, where the leaks are supposed to have been coming from or aimed at. So I think it's a very, very good piece of news that this appointment has taken place, and I think it just goes to show that PR is far more than just a job, it is a vocation. And one of the commentators talking about this particular man who's been appointed said what's really great is that his faith is rock solid. And I think for any of us working in church communications of whatever kind, we have to have rock solid faith. And communications from the church isn't just media, it's drafting material for agencies and for bishops and for all sorts of people. It's being available 24/7 to answer questions by email or by phone. And to do that, you really do have to have a great passion for the church and for the message of the gospel. So I think perhaps on that note, I'd like to say thank you for your indulgence, and I really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you.